Sucker Punch is a fascinating studio. Their first game for Sony was Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus way back on the PS2. It was a cel-shaded platformer with a family-friendly angle like Jak and Daxter or Ratchet and Clank. They made 2 more family-friendly Sly games before starting over fresh with a mature angle on superheroes with the Infamous series that was on PS3. And they continued to make 3 of those games before moving on to what would become their greatest work, this game, Ghost of Tsushima. I go through their history because it illustrates how far out of left field this game was. When Ghost of Tsushima gameplay was shown at E3 2018, it landed, for me, with a resounding and awkward thud. Sucker Punch has been quiet for 4 long years up to this point. The studio that made open-world platformers now emerged from the shadows with some kind of hybrid between Tenchu and Soul Calibur. Sucker Punch was always a studio that combined dynamic combat with 3D platforming, but this new game seemed to take out the platforming entirely. Basically, I hated it. I ignored the game for 2 years, ignoring the excellent review scores and follow-up DLC months later, directing my attention instead into the imminent PS5. In early 2022, I ended up buying it on a whim though, when my friend expressed interest in the game. After hearing his pitch, I decided to finally jump in too, and I'm really glad that I did. The game takes place in a fictional 1274 AD. The Mongols truly did invade Japan at that time, but the unfolding events here is mostly fiction. Still, this fiction is both convincing and captivating. Tsushima Island is filled with interesting characters, gorgeous locales, and incredibly unique side quests. As you journey across the island, you'll see Japan in all 4 seasons, along with dynamic varieties of weather that include storms and fog. The changes in weather are gorgeous to see in real time, but the game's photography mode gives you a surprising amount of control over the weather as well, when you're trying to capture the perfect scene. Even if you aren't interested in photography though, playing specific songs on your flute will allow you to change the weather on the fly in real time. So if you want it to be foggy, you play the fog song on the flute, or if you want it to be sunny, which I usually did, you just play the sunshine song. And you can do the same thing with rain as well. So when I was getting sick of riding in the rain, I just pull out the flute and boom, change the weather instantly. It's really cool to see. Small touches like this aren't necessary to make a great game, yet the experience is made up by examples like this time and again. One of the secondary activities you'll find scattered throughout the map is locations for the main character, Jin, to sit down and reflect on his experiences. When Jin sees a waterfall, he may reflect on the passage of time and begin writing a haiku. The screen will fill with suggestions that relate to this idea, and the player will select the lines of poetry that best harmonize with this theme. There's no score here, and there's no way to win or lose. You're just making poetry. It's authentic reflection and poetry for the mere sake of it. And your reward for completing these is always a cosmetic item that has no bearing on your gameplay or character stats. It's usually like a headband, and each headband will look unique, but all it is cosmetic. It's really cool, and it's such a low-key, simple side quest, and I want to say there are dozens of them, but I find it so interesting that they really did that at all. At a glance, it can seem dreadfully boring, but I can't help but respect that the developers insisted on making these activities a major part of the game. It speaks to the idea of Ghost being as much of an experience as it is a game, and asks you to set aside violence and quietly reflect for a few short moments. It's ballsy design decision to be convinced that your action game about slaughtering hundreds of invading Mongols can somehow speak about the turmoil of inner thoughts and personal conflict. Yet it does, and Sucker Punch should be applauded for that. I personally enjoyed the haikus and the simple little platforming that the Inari Shrines presented. As intense as the action is, having a respite between combat sequences beautifully balances the experience of the game, and it makes long play sessions far more palatable. Speaking of action, most encounters are going to set Jin against a group of Mongols that'll be carrying every Mongolian weapon imaginable. How Jin attacks each enemy will depend on the weapon they're using, and you'll need to adjust his sword stance with the R2 button to most effectively combat them. Each enemy will be weak to a particular stance depending on the weapon they're carrying, and you have to adapt your stance and your combat approach on the fly. It can sound complicated, but the game introduces stances slowly over several hours, easing you into the idea of managing different sword styles available to you. In the second half of the game, you'll have Jin's entire arsenal at your disposal, and you'll have a tremendous variety of options for disposing your enemies. I could write a 3-hour essay on how enjoyable the combat is, but I'll shorten it by saying this is my favorite melee combat in an action game ever. Since its release, I've been able to read and watch dozens of reviews on this game. A lot of folks seem to be down on the stealth mechanics, touting bad AI and unfair circumstances. I honestly don't see it. I'm not trying to defend the game here, as I don't really feel it needs a defense, but I didn't have a problem with it. Even if the stealth here was garbage, this would still be a top tier game for one, but I loved the stealth mechanics. I thought the AI was reasonably difficult. It's reasonably predictable. So for example, you could throw a distraction at the ground for an enemy to look at, and they were reliably distracted by it. But they also, I found, had enough brains to be looking out for me when something didn't feel right. The camps and bases that Jin sneaks around are often quite cramped, making enemy placement cluttered at times. So if you want to be stealthy, you'll need to cleverly draw them away from each other and use your arrows, kunai, smoke bombs, and firecrackers effectively. Jin has a lot of tools available to him. And although he does have a lot of tools, I found myself really only using them when I was trying to be stealthy. Most of his stuff available to him can be used in combat, but when I was in combat, I pretty much only used my sword, because I found most of the fights, even as challenging as some of them were, I thought they were perfectly manageable without the items. And I was playing on the normal difficulty level. Scuffles generally don't last longer than a minute or two, as most enemies are dispatched in 3 or 4 hits, and I liked this tempo, particularly for story missions, where the game really outshines its contemporaries. Ghost of Tsushima's story follows Jin's tale of rescuing his island from the Mongol invaders, but he's aided by a small cast of allies that he needs to help through his journey in order to earn their cooperation. Gotta remember, so the island of Tsushima here is like plunged into war, plunged into chaos. So there's a ton of bandits, and what few samurai are left alive really just kind of want to do their own thing. And so Jin struggles through the story to get people to help him. These stories lightly follow the template of like a Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption game, but they differ in how deep and relatable and human the stories are. Each character throughout the story wrestles with the same moral struggle that Jin does between upholding the values of their people in the midst of war and compromising their beliefs in order to survive. Each character wrestles with this in their own way, and I found it so interesting watching them hold each other accountable in some scenes, but then make compromises in others. It's so realistic that each character was ultimately trying to be good, but struggled with their own hypocrisy at almost every crossroad. Ghost side quests all play with these themes, and each mission further serves these micro stories. I can only think of a few missions that actually felt like they were filler. Most of them move the story along beautifully and follow a nice cadence between new twists. By the end of the game, you'll have concluded these stories of a half dozen other characters that all bring unique perspective to the struggle of war. Each story here is satisfying, and especially the story of our main character, Jin. Without spoilers, Ghost of Tsushima succeeds at completely wrapping up its own story, and yet leaving just enough room to justify a potential sequel. When you play on cloud, Ghost will run on native PS4 hardware. The game miraculously has almost no loading screens, especially on PS5. It's amazing. So jumping in is quick, even if you're playing on PS4 or on cloud. However, be warned, on cloud, you will be playing at 1080p and 30 frames per second. For most players in the cloud, that won't be any trouble, But if you've been spoiled by the frame rates in GeForce Now, then the performance here might be an issue. In fairness, that's more of a problem with PlayStation's streaming service than the game, as Ghost runs at 60 frames per second on the PS5. In conclusion, Ghost of Tsushima was the perfect game to wrap up the seminal PlayStation 4 generation. 2 years removed from its initial release, its place as a pillar of PlayStation excellence is clear. Sucker Punch is bound to this tale now. To move on to any other project would be to betray the incredible potential of its story. This is a masterpiece of a game, and perhaps my favorite PlayStation exclusive franchise.